Hello and welcome everyone. This is second and concluding lecture on Rousseau, and in this lecture today we are going to focus on his notion of general will, that is the basis of sovereignty in the political society or political community that Rousseau envisaged. So, in the first part of the lecture today we are going to focus on his views on general will, and before that how this political community is constituted through a covenant, what are the conditions of such a constitution, and then in the second part today we will look at the critical assessment of Rousseau's political thought or philosophical position, and finally we will also have a kind of summary of the contribution of social contract tradition in the history of Western political thought. If you recall the first lecture that we have had on Rousseau, we have discussed his personal life and how he was a self-taught thinker and developed many paradoxes. So, where he was a modern thinker, but also he was someone who was looking at the pre-modern social living or associational life, the value of morality, which would create a public spirited citizen. In contrast to that, the modern secular, atheistic, rationalized living Rousseau despised, and his social contract email was a kind of argument against such kind of corrupting influence that was there in modern life, particularly in Paris and in many other states in Europe as well. So, as a theorist of popular sovereignty, how Rousseau envisaged a new kind of social association which would enable the individual to live a free life without being corrupted by the socialization or the corrupting influence of society or religion. So, some of these thoughts we have discussed in the previous lecture. Today we will start with how he argue about a political community and its formation, and what role general will play in the stability of political stability or ensuring the equality and liberty of individual. So, if we start by this idea that Rousseau's argument about popular sovereignty, is based on this idea of general will, and this idea of general will in Rousseau's philosophy is somewhat ambiguous and also controversial. So, many scholars believe that this idea of general will or the popular sovereignty which is based on general will is something which led to the rise of totalitarian regimes in the 20th century, and Rousseau draws a kind of a strong connection between his idea of general will, political authority, sovereignty and the laws that is there in the state. So, we will see in a moment how Rousseau argued about a popular sovereignty that is based on general will, and this idea of general will is far more complex than it appears. So, there is a kind of a strong connection between his idea of popular sovereignty and general will, that is the basis of all forms of political authority and laws in the society. So, in that sense there is a kind of continuum between general will, popular sovereignty, political authority and laws in the state that Rousseau envisaged. So, Rousseau was both a kind of celebrated thinker, but as well as a much despised political thinker in Europe, and we have discussed this in the previous lecture, that how his former allies or colleagues regarded many of his thought or ideas as contrary to the Enlightenment project that was based on the refinement of human character on the basis of reason and rationality. So, Rousseau was celebrated thinker, but also a much despised political thinker in Europe, and that has led to the wide reading of his work, at the same time simultaneous condemnation, banning and public burning of his work. So, there are many paradoxes in his thought, and this we will discuss in detail when we will look at the critical assessment of Rousseau's political thought. So, he argued that general will should be binding to all, and those who refuse to obey the general will shall be forced to obey it. So, there is a kind of number of paradoxes in Rousseau, where on the one hand he says that the general will is the expression of individuals' own will when they are guided by the public spirit or life of the community and not by their private selfish interest. However, he also argues that individuals would be individuals. So, man as they are and laws as it should be. So, Rousseau's objective was to create a law, create a public institution or a republic which would enable the individual to live a much more harmonious or unified life, and that is possible when individual realize the need of community and associate his or her own self with the self of the community, and thereby there is no scope of disobeying the general will. So, in that sense Rousseau's paradox is that human beings can be forced to be free, and there is a kind of use of force, and yet that use of force is according to Rousseau for the freedom of individual, and there are many such paradoxes that we will discuss. And this general will need not to be aggregate will of the majority or even few. So, his characterization of general will is also somewhat ambiguous, that is the general will is not the aggregate or the collective will of the every member of the society. So, every member sitting in the assembly expressing their will, and then you aggregate those wills and that would be general will. That is not the case according to Rousseau. General will has a very specific characteristic, and that we will discuss in a few moments. So, Rousseau as a republican thinker wanted to create a political community in which human being could live a free and equal life. So, the central pillar in Rousseau's political philosophy is his emphasis on liberty and equality, and that becomes the slogan of French Revolution, if you like, along with the idea of liberty, equality and fraternity. So, according to Rousseau, men can genuinely realize this freedom in civil society by following the laws which they themselves legislate. So, thus citizens in a political community would be both author, and being author that means citizen, and also the subject of laws. So, there is a kind of another paradox in Rousseau's thought, where he envisaged members of political community as both citizen and also subject. And citizen, if you like, is a modern concept where the member of a political community have certain rights which a state is supposed to protect, and it is different from the idea of subject, which is the obligation that members have towards the king without having any rights. So, the difference between modern notion of citizenship with the pre-modern idea of subject is that the modern citizen have certain rights which are inalienable, and state must uphold or protect those rights, whereas the subject is something which is having the obligation towards the state without having any recognizable rights. So, in the monarchy in the pre-modern times, individuals in the state were merely subject, not the citizens. So, they cannot rightfully demand from the state to recognize their rights and protect it. Whereas, in Rousseau you have this kind of paradox where he envisaged a political community where the individual member would be both the author, and being author as citizen, and also the subject of law. And subjecting to that law, Rousseau argues that human beings will be free and achieve self mastery. So, freedom for Rousseau is not a kind of private choice or a kind of personal self-aggrandizement, but it is living in association with the community. So, the individual and the community is in perfect harmony. By following the laws of community, individual follows their own self-legislated laws, so to say, and this is the kind of another paradox that we have in Rousseau. However, deriving from writers like Montesquieu, Rousseau also argue that the kind of freedom that exists vary from society to society depending upon their natural conditions of the people and the physical circumstances. So, Rousseau being a kind of pragmatic here, following this idea of the spirit of laws. So, should this freedom which he is talking about would be within the confine of laws of the community or the general will. By following the general will, human beings will realize their freedom, which enables them to live a moral life. So, he argues that this kind of freedom is not available to all kind of community across the circumstances. It will vary from people to people depending upon their own nature. So, giving primacy to the republican ideas or the active participation of the people is the basis for the realization of this kind of freedom. So, it varies from society to society depending upon the nature of the individual in those society or natural circumstances. Now, if we look at Rousseau's argument on the formation of body politic, which is the basis of political rights or civil rights for the individual, which is different from the freedom that individual enjoys in the state of nature. So, Rousseau in Social Contract envisages a body politic that would create the conditions of freedom and equality for the individual, and this combination of freedom and equality is very at the very center of Rousseau's philosophy. So, if you recall his second discourse on inequality and how to overcome it, how to legitimize a political rule or a system of rule which would create the condition for everyone and not just the few propertied to live the life of liberty and equality. And in the social contract, the imagination of body politic is about creating those conditions which would provide equality and liberty to every member of the community and not just the few privileged or propertied one. The formation of the body politic then is based on a covenant, thereby it is the artificial construct, it is not natural. So, human beings in the state of nature does not live associational life. So, his association with others is episodic and based on the needs, such as for when they go for hunting, otherwise there is no ties in the state of nature. It is only in the society that human beings began to live with the family, with the community, and that living has certain obligation that tied them to those family or community, which is a kind of bondage for the individual. So, to live then the associational life in the political community is the artificial construct that is in accordance with the social contract tradition, that the social or the political institution is not something which is natural. It is result of the covenant or contract among the free, independent, consenting individual, and the consent is then the basis of the legitimacy of the political rule. So, the formation of the body politic is based on a covenant that transforms the multitude of people into what Rousseau called a people, and that is a kind of hint towards the idea of nationalism. So, when multitude of people coming together through a covenant create a political society that has its own culture, that has its own general will, and that is decided through the active participation of all its members. This kind of imagination also has the hint of modern nation or nationalism. So, this multitude of people and their transformation into a people is the result of the covenant among the free, independent, autonomous individual who are also equal. So, the constitution of this body politic according to Rousseau is the basis of all social, economic, political rights for the individual. So, individual enjoys their right only after the formation of this body politic through covenant. Prior to that, there is no recognized rights. Individuals were free and equal in the state of nature, but there is not recognition of that by any other body. Where after the formation of body politic, all the rights of the individual, social, economic and political rights are guaranteed and protected, in a sense put in a more firm footings, or having greater protection of these rights after the formation of political community. So, according to Rousseau, the act by which people become a people, that means having a very distinct identity, distinct will, which he calls general will, is crucial, and it is also the real foundation of society. And in this society, freedom implies following the rules which individuals themselves legislate. So, in this body politic, individual will remain as free as they are by following those laws which they themselves have legislated. So, the terms of contract or covenant that becomes the basis of society requires that each individual totally alienate himself and all his rights to the whole community. So, the first term of this contract is that for the multitude of people to become a people, it is required that the all individuals should alienate himself, that is his own person, and all his rights to the whole community. So, once they are part of the political community, they associate themselves, identify themselves with the whole community totally. There is no kind of gap, there is no kind of personal rights which is different from the community rights and its existence. Thus, individual gives away their natural freedom and rights to the community, and this is done on the strict condition of equality. That means, when other individual also, when they agree to be part of that political community, should also forego their individual rights or their belonging. So, in Rousseau's imagination, the political community is something which completely identify the individual with the whole of the community and whole of the community with the individual. So, individual remains sovereign and free by completely identifying himself with the community, that is the whole. So, there is no in between the individual and the whole community. So, there is a kind of organic relationship, so to say, between individual and community that Rousseau envisaged, when individual have no personal rights, no private rights, when they agree to become the part of a political community. Second, this alienation of rights is unconditional. It is not based on certain condition as in Hobbes for the protection of life, or in Locke for the protection of life, liberty and property. Here, this alienation of rights by the individual to the political community is unconditional. So, the union of the individual with the community is as perfect as it could be. So, this kind of political community then would be a community for which human being would give up all that is precious to him, even his life, for the protection of community. And there is nothing that one can think of worth living for, or worth protecting for outside the community. So, this union between individual and the community is a kind of organic union where nothing is left outside this union, and that way the political community would be as perfect as it could be. And therefore, he argues that the alienation of individual rights to the political community is unconditional, not on any condition. So, not like Hobbes and Locke for the protection of certain rights, but this is the voluntarily giving away of one's rights for the sake of achieving self mastery or achieving freedom as they had in the state of nature, and that one can do by completely identifying with the community and community identifying with the people. So, finally, the unity thus constituted would be a source of order and beneficial for all, as it is based on a strict reciprocity of equal and mutual dependence. Since each man gives himself to all and not to other man or group of men, the relationship between the individual and the community is that of whole to the particular and particular to the whole, not one particular to the other particular group of men. So, since each man gives himself to all, he give himself to no one, that is, the rules of the community or general will thus constituted on the basis of this political community is the reflection of individuals' own will, when guided by the public spirit and not by their personal spirit. So, thus constituted political body would be a small community of free and equal members, where no one would have enough wealth to buy another and none poor enough to force to sell himself. And this is another characteristic of Rousseau's political community, where he despised all forms of hierarchy, particularly the economic inequalities. And he argued that you cannot think of equality and liberty in a society where one person or few person have resources enough to buy the other person, and multitude of people would be living in the condition of servitude. So, he wanted to create a political community which would be a small community, where no person would have enough wealth to buy another person and none would be poor enough to be forced to sell himself. Though directly and actively participating in legislating laws, these members then remain as free as before and enjoying the life of liberty and perfect equality in the society. Thus, in such a community, each one of us puts in the community his person and all his powers under the supreme direction of the general will. And as a body, we incorporate every member as indivisible part of the whole. So, if some of you can recall the Gandhian idea of oceanic circle, where the individual member of the community is part of the larger community, and larger community cannot do away with that particular individual. So, the part sustain the whole and whole sustain the part. There is some kind of similar argument here in Rousseau's idea of individual member to the body politic. The paradox here is Rousseau's description of man as both citizens and subjects of the body politic. They are citizen as they are its creator. So, the whole body politic or general will is created or authored by its citizen, but they are also subject as they are obliged to obey its laws. So, once general will is formed, the same citizen turns into subjects and they have obligation to follow the general will, and if they refuse to do so, they will be forced to obey it, in that sense forced to be free according to Rousseau. So, Rousseau argued that the real freedom is in following the general will, and those who refuse to obey it would be forced to do so. He explained that that it is in such a community that man would learn moral freedom and self mastery. So, the freedom for Rousseau is not in living the private life or in the pursuit of personal interest, but living the associational life in the community, guided by the public spirit or in the pursuit of public spirit. So, there is no kind of divide here in personal interest of the individual and the public interest of the community. which has created a kind of divided self according to Rousseau in modern social political life. So, there is a kind of argument for organic associational life of individual with the community, where both are indispensable to each other and willing to sacrifice everything for the sake of other. So, then the realization of freedom is the moral freedom, or the achievement of self mastery is through participation in the life of community. Now, let us discuss his ideas on general will. General will in Rousseau's thought is an ambiguous concept and also very controversial concept. So, the first characteristic of this general will is it cannot be delegated to any other body or represented by any other body. That means, it must be legislated by the people themselves, and it cannot be delegated to or represented by any other body than the people themselves. So, there is a kind of direct republican notion reflected once again here, where the general will is constituted by the people themselves through direct participation. So, he despised say English parliament or periodic election and representative form of government, where people are free only once in 5 years or 4 years when elections are held. So, after that day of voting, again the representative takes over, and there is the conditions of unfreedom for the masses or for the citizens. So, in contrast to that, Rousseau argued that general will is something which cannot be delegated to or represented by any other body than the people themselves. So, they legislated. Now, this general will could be the will of the majority, or it can be the will of few of its member, or even one enlightened citizen who are guided by the real will of everyone in the community. Only condition for that is that they are free from their personal or selfish interest. So, the constitution of general will then requires not the aggregate will of the whole community, that is the collective expression of each members, and then you decide what is general will. It can be will of the majority or few or even one member of the political community when they are guided by the enlightened interest of the community, not their personal, selfish or sectional interest. So, the general will that therefore is the will of the whole community, not the particular will or the sectional will of any group in the community, and it is binding on all. However, it is not the aggregate will of all its members. So, that is characteristic of general will and its formation. Now, its characteristic is that it must be followed wholly or neither. So, there cannot be modification or alteration in the implementation or in the following of general will. So, general will must be followed, and there is a kind of continuum here between the idea of general will and the popular sovereignty or the political authority of the state or government or its laws. All these derive its authority from the general will, and it must be wholly accepted or followed by all the institution and all the members in the community without exception, and if they do so, then they can be forced to be free according to Rousseau. Now, it must be general will to become general will, which is different from personal or private will of the individual. It must be general in its purpose. So, as well as in its nature, that it should spring from all and apply to all. So, that is the characterization of general will, where Rousseau argues that general will is to be decided on the basis of its purpose. So, where the individual will and his private or personal will is towards gratifying his personal interest or selfish interest, or a group of people and their will would be for the gratification of their sectional or private or group interest. However, general will must be something that caters towards the collective will or the general will of the community, not the particular or the sectional interest of its member. And then suppose the private will as an individual, it should be followed by that private individual or the group of individual, but general will must be followed by every single member in the community. That distinguishes general will again from the private will or the sectional interest in the society. In other words, general will is the expression of what is already there in everyone's heart. It may be expressed by majority, it may be expressed by the few or by one person, but it gives expression to what is already there in each one's heart. So, many people may not be aware of it, may not be conscious of it, and therefore live the life of bondage and unfreedom. Now, the task of the community is to then force that individual to realize what is general and what is free for himself, and in that sense he should be forced to be free. So, the general will is the expression of what is already there in everyone's heart when they are guided by public interest and not by their selfish interest. So, the general will thus constituted would be sovereign and is always rightful and always tend to the public good. So, thus general will guided by the public spirit would always be rightful. So, there is no question of corruption or wrongdoings on the basis of general will. It is always right and cater to the needs of the whole community, not the private individual or the group or the sections in any society. So, if you compare it with let us say modern plural democracy, so there are multitude of groups in the society with varying and often contradictory interest. Rousseau do not consider that all of them should represent the will of the community or the political community. That is very different from the private or the sectional group interest that different groups or the parties propagate and strive to achieve in modern liberal plural democracy. Rousseau gives more a kind of Platonic idea of a kind of harmony of human will, that is individual should live not a divided life, one for the self and other for the rest of the people or rest of the group members in the community, but a kind of harmonious whole within, and then the general will should be the expression of that harmony that should be there in the individual, that was there in the state of nature. Only the corrupting influence of the society has taken away that harmony, the internal harmony that is there, and that should be there in the individual. In the similar way, the general will should be the expression of that harmony. It can be expressed by majority or few or one person, but that represent the will that is there in each one's heart, whether they are conscious of it or not. So, it cannot be wrong therefore. So, laws which guarantees the rights of individuals in society are therefore the expressions of the general will. So, the laws are necessary, as human beings cannot enjoy or exercise their rights without the laws. So, laws guarantee or protect the rights, but these laws themselves are a kind of expression of general will of the community. However, Rousseau also realized that for the simple and natural man who lived the life of free and equal members in the state of nature, it is difficult to see what is good for the people. So, although they desire for it, so the majority of people in the community would desire that the state should function for the interest of all, but they themselves do not see or identify which course of action would be beneficial for the whole community. To resolve this tension, Rousseau envisaged the role of a legislator who assumes some kind of semi-divine characteristic that enables him, that is the legislator, to persuade the sovereign body without force that those things necessary for redeeming a corrupt people have behind them the authority of God. So, there is a kind of again some kind of established theological ideas that guides Rousseau's argument here, where to sustain the general will or the political stability in the community, he do not want a kind of debate and discussion every now and then about what is general will and the acrimonious or the conflicting positions about a general will. He wanted some kind of stability which would be something like semi-divine, which would naturally command respect or obligation from the people without recourse to violence or use of force. So, people will be willing to subject themselves to such notion of general will when it is persuaded to them that it is some kind of semi-divine or having the authority of God. And remember, in Rousseau there is a kind of suspicion towards atheists, partly because their loyalty or patriotism to the state can be questioned. So, Rousseau resolved this tension of identifying and constituting the general will through this idea of a legislator who would make it more acceptable, more established or more firm than everyday interaction and debates about it. So, Rousseau also argued that this lawgiver, which he called the wise lawgiver, begins not by laying down laws that is good in themselves, but by finding out whether the people for whom the laws are intended is able to support them. So, here he is again reflecting a kind of Montesquieu's argument about the spirit of laws, that means the laws and its application and the success of the law depends on the nature or the characteristic of the people, and it varies from community to community. So, Rousseau also recognized the inner conflicts between the particular and the sectional interest of the people and the general will. However, rather than seeking reconciliation, so like all politics, particularly in if you recall Aristotle, also in Machiavelli, politics is all about having conflicting position and then reconciliating those conflicting position and to arrive at certain workable propositions. Rousseau, however, like Plato, wanted to transcend this conflict between personal interest or sectional interest and general will by creating a harmonious existence between the self and the community. So, there is a kind of complete identification of the whole with the part and part with the whole, thereby creating a state or sovereign based on general will, which would have more power than Hobbesian Leviathan. So, everyone must obey general will unconditionally without exception. If they do so, then they can be forced to be free. So, first Rousseau create a political community where part and the whole has perfect union. There is perfect identification of the political community with its individual member and individual member with the political community. Thereby, the general will, that is the expression of that community, must be followed universally, unconditionally, without exception. If there are exceptions, then it is the responsibility of the community to forcefully apply them or implement them or force them to obey the general will. So, civil religion he talks about as a kind of mechanism which would enable the individual to develop these civic responsibilities and public spiritedness and participation in the life of community, which was not natural. Unlike Aristotle, who said that men are by nature a social being or a social animal, Rousseau do not consider man as naturally a social being. So, in the state of nature, that association with other is episodic, casual and need based, whereas in the community man must learn how to live with others and participate in the life of community. To learn that, he envisaged a kind of civil religion which would be different from the Christian religion that teach man to live otherworldly and live for otherworldly life and have less and less participation in the temporal world or in this life. So, civil religion is the new faith for the citizens, which imbibe in them their duty and obligation towards the republic. Rousseau also advocated the existence of censorial tribunal to shape the morality of citizens and regulate public opinions to prevent its corrupting influence. So, this again he echoes Plato. So, all forms of arts and literature and expression of public opinion do not have conducive implication on the morality of the members of political community. So, there has to be a kind of censorship, there has to be some kind of regulation of public opinion, arts, literature, which may have corrupting influence on the people. So, Rousseau also envisaged such kind of tribunal. He also acknowledged the role of government in the implementation of laws and in punishing the wrongdoers and violators of general will. However, the government should function as the subservient of the general will. So, the idea of general will is the sovereign, the real authority in the political community, and all the agents and the members of that political community derive its power and authority from that general will. So, this general will is sovereign, which power is indivisible and limitless. He also adopts the classification of government into democracy, aristocracy and monarchy. No form of government is illegitimate if it follows the general will. So, in Rousseau you have also the classification of governments, and no form of government is illegitimate if it follows the general will. However, he has some criticism against democracy and thought of a kind of combination of rules between democracy, aristocracy and monarchy depending upon the nature of the people and its population. So, if it is a small community with few members, then democracy or direct form of democracy is the most suitable form of government for them. However, if it is a medium sized state or community, then aristocracy is a better government for that community, and if it is larger than that, then the monarchy could be most suitable form of government. So, inherently none of these form of government are legitimate or illegitimate. Only condition is if they act or perform according to the general will, then they can serve the interest of the whole community and protect its members and provide them the condition of liberty and equality, what is the that is the basis for the formation of political community. So, now we move on to the second part, that is the critical assessment of Rousseau's thought. So, Rousseau was a theorist of popular sovereignty. His personal life and political treatises are riddled with many paradoxes. So, the first paradox starts with the opening statement of social contract, where he writes that men were born free, however, he is everywhere in chains. He invoked the simple inherently good nature of human beings in the state of nature, yet he argued that true freedom is moral and civil, enjoyable only in the political community. In his description of the general will, he made the individual simultaneously as citizen, author of the laws and also its subjects. So, there are many paradoxes in Rousseau's writings. Similarly, there is a religious and moral content in his description of civil religion, yet he gave it a more secular foundation and thereby inviting criticism from the church. Similar was his invocation of passion and sentiment and yet preference for reason. The greatest of all paradoxes in Rousseau was his argument that an individual can be forced to be free. So, the use of force he justified in the name of freedom. So, these kind of contradictory and paradoxical statement makes the writings of Rousseau fascinating, at the same time controversial. So, this makes his work fascinating and controversial at the same time, and his belief in simplistic natural life combined with the religious belief and anti-rational standpoints led many Enlightenment thinkers such as Voltaire to see his work as anti-progress and sliding into tyrannical and ignorant dark age. His book Emile and Social Contract were condemned, banned and publicly burned. It was only after the French Revolution that his works were widely read again, and Edmund Burke, however, hold him responsible for the bloody revolution and Jacobean reign of terror that followed French Revolution, which eventually led to the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte autocratic regime in France. Rousseau's paradoxical thought and range of interest have led various contradictory interpretation. So, in the 18th century, he was regarded as counter-enlightenment thinker who challenged the notion of progress and reason or rationality as an accurate guide of humanity. So, in his lifetime, much of the criticism against Rousseau was that he was the supporter of counter-enlightenment tradition and questioned progress and rationality that human beings achieved through the use of science and reason. In the 19th century, however, Rousseau was regarded as the father of French Revolution, who coined the terms or put emphasis on the value of liberty and equality, and also the founder of Romantic movement, arguing for simplistic, small communities living in the state of nature. In the 20th century, he was either considered to be the democratic republican thinker or vilified as the forerunner of totalitarian regimes such as fascism and Nazism. Feminist scholars and philosophers like Mary Wollstonecraft accused Rousseau of subordinating women to men. So, his argument for equality and liberty and disgust for condition of servitude was limited only to the men. Women were regarded as naturally weak and passive who must submit to the will of man, and that remains the valid critique of social contract thinkers by the feminist scholars. So, Rousseau did not want women to play any role in the active life of the republic, and that has led to his support for liberty and equality to all, and his critique of economic inequality that exist in any society, or the corrupting influence of the society on the men who are inherently good and honest. So, however, his support for these ideas are not applicable to women. However, despite the inherent paradoxes and limitation, the range of interpretation of Rousseau's thought establishes the profound influence of his philosophical positions. So, he influenced the democrats and autocrats alike. He was one of the most original and complex political thinkers in modern West. The intellectual debate as to whether Rousseau was a thinker of a totalitarian, republican or democratic regime is far from settled. So, there is continued interest in the works of Rousseau and his characterization as a totalitarian thinker or republican or democratic thinker. So, his works profoundly influenced the philosophy of Goethe, Kant, Marx and Nietzsche. He was the great champion of revolutionary ideas like liberty, equality and popular sovereignty, which shaped the French Revolution that overthrew the ancient regime in France, which was based on class hierarchy, and paved the way for the republican form of government in the modern world. Now, we briefly look at the social contract tradition and their contribution in the history of Western political thought. So, one of the most significant contribution of social contract tradition that emerged in 17th and 18th century Europe is the idea that political authority, sovereignty and political obligation are based on the consent of the ruled or governed, and that becomes the legitimizing ground for modern democracy or democratic states. So, even in modern democracies across the globe, and for that matter even the outright authoritarian regime or military junta will claim to govern a country in the name of people or legitimize their rule by explaining or by arguing that they represent the real or the genuine will of the people. So, this is the major contribution of social contract tradition in Europe, where now the legitimacy of all forms of political authority, their sovereignty is not dependent not on the divine right theory of the king, but on the consent of those who are governed or those who are ruled. So, all state must then seek the consent of the people or the governed they claim to rule. So, among these social contract traditions, as we have discussed, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, there were obvious differences between them and the kind of sovereign they envisaged. So, in Locke you have a kind of limited form of government. In Hobbes and Rousseau you have the absolute notion of sovereignty. So, there are internal differences between them. However, they all belong to the social contract tradition. That means, the state is a result of covenant and contract, which argued that the state as an artificial or corporate entity is an artificial construct which is based on a contract among free, equal and autonomous individuals, and that led to the rise of liberal idea that the rights are that of the individual for which a state is constructed, and a state must protect those rights. So, the formation of the state as an artificial construct is based on the consent or the contract among the free, independent and autonomous individuals, and this was the basis for the new ways of thinking about politics and political authority, which was radically different from the divine right theory of the king, and that is again the major contribution of social contract tradition. Locke postulates a theory of limited government, whereas Hobbes and Rousseau present a theory of absolute sovereign power. One of the major criticism against the thinkers of social contract tradition, however, is the fact their argument of social contract or state of nature was hypothetical and ahistorical rather than real or the actual evolution of society or modern state. So, the society is not formed through contract in the real world. Not all the people will come together and give consent to a group of people or form the state. So, this argument is based on hypothetical idea of a state of nature and therefore, is ahistorical rather than real. So, in this sense their theory of the state was ahistorical. However, these theorists and their treatises have decisively shaped the discourse on modern politics, state and sovereignty, and much of the discussion that we have on state, politics individual, their rights, the idea of sovereignty is based on the treatises written by these social contract traditions thinkers. So, that is all in today's lecture. For today's lecture, you can refer to some of these books like David Butcher and Paul Kelly, Political Thinkers from Socrates to the Present, Gary Browning, A History of Modern Political Thought, The Questions of Interpretation. You should also read this Murray Forsyth and Maurice Kinsoper, A Guide to Political Classics, Plato to Rousseau, and Cephalagia remains the reference text for this course. You can read Western Political Thought from the Ancient Greeks to Modern Times. If you want to read more advanced interpretation of Rousseau's political thought or philosophy, you should refer to Patrick Riley, The Cambridge Companion to Rousseau, and James Allen Rann on Politics, A History of Political Thought from Herodotus to the Present, and Robert Walkler, Rousseau, A Very Short Introduction, or other text you should refer to understand more about Rousseau and his contribution to Western political thought. So, that is all in today's lecture. Thanks for listening. Do share your comments and feedbacks. We will be happy to respond. Thank you all.